At my sister's engagement party, security stopped me at the entrance. "Mum, you're not on the list," the guard said, brows pinched in polite confusion, as he tilted his tablet screen toward me. I stared at the screen. A neat digital scroll of approved names: Margaret Monroe, David Monroe, Lily Monroe, Ethan Caldwell. All present and accounted for. All except me. Claire Monroe, the eldest daughter. The one who spent her 20s decoding encrypted malware while her family posted brunch photos with "thus proud of all Lily." Behind the security gate, I saw them, my parents glowing as they exited a sleek black SUV, and my sister Lily, radiant in a white cocktail dress, arm in arm with her fiancé Ethan. They were greeted like royalty handshakes, camera flashes, the whole show. And me, I was the guest they forgot. Or rather, the guest they deliberately left out. This wasn't an oversight. It was curated exclusion packaged with a bow. As if summoned by the awkward standoff, Ethan glanced over. His smile sharpened the moment he saw me. He leaned toward Lily, just loud enough for the guard to hear, "She's just a data girl." Not exactly a highlight. I saw Lily's laugh, quick, practiced, dismissive. I didn't flinch, I didn't blink. But inside, something ancient cracked. Not for the insult, but for how ordinary it had become. You learn to live with the small betrayals, the missed calls, the unacknowledged promotions, the family group texts that mysteriously skip your number. You tell yourself you're strong. You focus on work. You build your life in shadows. But even shadows get tired of being silent. "I work under Department 12, I said calmly to the guard, not for them, but for myself. He paled a little, then stood straighter. "Mom, I'll let me check with someone." I waved him off. "It's okay," I said. "I didn't come here to be seen." The truth was, I came to witness something I thought I'd let go of long ago, the final scene of a family drama where I was never cast, only used as a lighting crew. The building loomed behind the gates, glass and gold and ceremony. I had read the event schedule weeks ago, not from an invitation, but from a security sweep brief. I knew more about this building's blind spots and exits than the wedding planner did. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was invisible on paper, but irreplaceable on the back end. As I stood there still outside, I remembered the exact moment I stopped asking to be included. I was 17, watching Lily get fitted for her sweet 16 gown, white tulle rhinestones like falling stars. Mum had said, "Claire, let her have this moment. Yours will come." It never did. What came instead were scholarships I filed for myself, dorm rooms I decorated alone, and phone calls that never came on birthdays. Ethan's smirk hadn't faded. He was enjoying this, enjoying the idea that I plain, serious, desk-bound Claire was once again on the wrong side of the velvet rope. He didn't know that the desk job he mocked had me working side by side with intelligence analysts who'd seen more threats than he could spell. He didn't know I was in charge of the very systems that flagged his name earlier this year for a security mismatch in active zones. He didn't know that, today of all days, I might be the only person who could keep his record clean. But I didn't say any of that. I just stood there watching, letting him write his story, letting them all live their scene. He had no idea the girl he erased from the guest list was the one holding the master key. I shifted my weight slightly, my heels sinking just a touch into the gravel path beneath the gate. The sun was almost too bright, one of those golden Maryland afternoons that seemed to mock anyone carrying heaviness inside. The breeze carried the faint scent of roses from the courtyard garden, perfectly trimmed and curated like everything else in Lily's world. I used to think beauty like that could heal things. I don't anymore. The guard was still checking, flipping through some internal contact list with a nervous energy that told me he was more afraid of making a mistake than offending me. I didn't blame him. Men like him were trained to follow protocol. What no one trains for is how to face someone who doesn't belong, but should have. I took a breath and stepped aside, letting a couple walk past me through the gate. They were middle-aged, well-dressed, and clearly familiar with my parents. "Oh, Margaret," the woman chirped, lilies glowing. And that ring, my goodness. My mother laughed, that carefully composed laugh she reserved for important people. I hadn't heard it in years, not directed at me anyway. I remembered when I used to rehearse how I'd reintroduce myself to the world. I thought maybe after a big award or a promotion, I'd get to walk into a family gathering and hear them say, "We had no idea." But reality is rarely that theatrical. Recognition doesn't come with applause when you've trained yourself to disappear. It comes in silent victories, a classified file with your name on it, a secure message from a 3-star general, a line of code that saves a convoy of soldiers from walking into a trap. And still, your mother calls to ask if you'll bring napkins to the potluck, because you're always good at remembering small things. My phone buzzed. It was a security ping, an internal note from one of the systems I monitored. Local access request flagged Caldwell Ethan. Temporary device mismatch. My eyes narrowed for a second, then softened. Of course. He was here and he hadn't updated his clearance token. Not a critical breach, but sloppy. Dangerous, even. I typed in a short override and stabilized the log. No one would know, least of all Ethan. That was always the joke. The desk jockey was the one who kept the doors from collapsing. A group of interns walked past me, probably from one of the catering services or floral vendors. They were laughing full of life, unaware of the ceremony's underlying hierarchies. One of them glanced at me and gave a small, almost apologetic smile, as if she sensed I was part of this day, just not in the way anyone had expected. I turned away from the gate and began walking along the edge of the building. Not toward the main entrance, but toward the service path, an access lane I knew from a floor plan I'd reviewed weeks ago. I wasn't here to crash the party. I wasn't here to beg my way in. I was here to observe, to watch, to remember, to let their story unfold exactly as they wrote it. Because one thing I'd learned over the years was, this people will show you who they are if you stop trying to edit their script. And as for me, I didn't need to rewrite mine. I'd already done that line by line in code, in systems, in protocols that protected people who'd never even say thank you. My name wasn't on the list, but the network that kept this event secure, that was mine. The fail-safes in case of emergency mine. The reason Ethan Caldwell's military record still had an unblemished string of approvals mine. I smiled, not the smile of someone let in, but the smile of someone who no longer needed the door. Let them keep their guest list. I had written my own. Let them keep their guest list. I had written my own. That smile lingered on my lips as I drove away from the venue, the iron gate shrinking in my rearview mirror like the final curtain closing on a play I never auditioned for. I didn't feel anger, not in the fiery cinematic way people expect. What I felt was quieter, deeper, like an echo in a hollow room I'd been walking through for years. It wasn't about this one day. It was about a lifetime of almosts and maybes, of being part of the frame, but never the picture. Back home, I poured myself a glass of water and wandered into the hallway, where old family photos lined the wall. I'd seen them 100 times growing up. The carefully chosen moments, Lily's ballet recital, Lily in her Girl Scout sash, Lily on the beach with her arms around Mom and Dad. My eyes scanned the frames, familiar and fixed, until they landed on one in particular, the Christmas portrait from when I was 16. I remembered that day. I had set up the tripod, adjusted the lighting, and taken 10 versions to make sure Lily's hair looked perfect. When the final photo was printed and framed, I wasn't in it. I'd gone to the kitchen to refill cider, and no one called me back. No one noticed I was missing, not until I pointed it out later and Mum laughed it off. "Oh, honey, someone had to take the picture." It was always like that. Every family moment came with a backstage pass for me. Birthday parties, where I wrapped my own gifts so Lily wouldn't feel bad if hers were smaller. Report cards no one asked about because Lily had just made honor choir. I wasn't unloved, not overtly. I was optional. Background. Necessary in function, invisible in form. Even when I left for college, early admission full scholarship, my send-off was a quiet breakfast. No photos, no balloons, just Dad checking his watch and Mum saying, "Don't forget to call if you need laundry tips." I didn't need them. I'd taught myself to iron shirts with a YouTube video, the same way I'd taught myself how to code at 13, because no one thought to teach me. People assume neglect is loud yelling. Doors slammed, meals skipped. But the most dangerous kind is soft. It's silence where questions should be. It's politeness that leaves no room for presence. It's being so well-behaved that no one wonders what you're hiding. I sat down on the living room couch, still holding the photo frame. My reflection shimmered faintly in the glass, an overlay of then and now. The girl in the memory wore a sweater 3 sizes too big, a nervous smile stretched too wide. The woman holding the frame had sharper eyes, not colder, just clearer. My fingers hovered over the corner of the frame, tempted to pull the photo out, re-edit the truth. But I didn't. I placed it back on the wall, right where it had always been, and stepped back. Let the ghosts stay where they chose to live. Instead, I walked to my desk and opened my laptop. A different kind of portrait lit up the screen: schematics, maps, vulnerability assessments, the digital landscape where I belonged, where my work spoke louder than my absence. No one here cared what I wore or how I looked in photos. They cared that I noticed the things no one else saw. I was running a deep scan of external access points when my screen pinged new email. Subject line: field brief, Caldwell Ethan. I clicked it open. Another deployment evaluation. Another instance of Ethan looking pristine on the surface, while the data told a more reckless story. Field delays, unauthorized logins, digital lapses. He always cleaned up well, but only because someone like me did the cleaning. My cursor hovered over the file. I could flag it, escalate it, or expose it. But I didn't. Not yet. Not because he deserved my silence, but because the reckoning would come in its own time. And when it did, it wouldn't be loud. It would be precise, undeniable, clean. I leaned back, letting the hum of my computer fill the room. In the corner, a faded postcard from my grandmother, Elsie, sat propped against a lamp. She was the only one who ever saw me without squinting. The last thing she gave me was a letter that said, "Your worth isn't decoration, Claire. It's structure. Without it, everything else collapses." I looked again at the family photos. I wasn't in most of them. But then again, I had been holding up the whole frame. That thought lingered as I dressed the next morning, tugging on a simple navy blouse and slacks sharp, but not too sharp. We had brunch reservations at Lily's favourite spot downtown, a pre-wedding family catch-up that I hadn't exactly been invited to, but had received a vague "you can come if you're free" text from Dad 2 days prior. It was enough to show up. I didn't expect warmth. I just wanted to know if they'd notice I was there. The restaurant was the kind with exposed brick walls, mimosa towers, and too loud music that made you feel like youth could be bottled and sold. When I arrived, they were already seated at a round table near the window, sunlight pooling across Lily's perfect curls and Mum's floral scarf like someone had filtered them in soft gold. My father stood to greet me out of habit more than affection, and Mum gave me a once-over smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You look professional," she said, as if that were mildly offensive at brunch. Lily beamed and reached for my hand like we were old friends. "Claire, so glad you could make it. Did you see the engagement photos yet? Ethan looks like he stepped out of a Ralph Lauren ad." I sat down in the only remaining chair, one pushed slightly away from the table, half blocked by a potted fiddle leaf fig. Someone had clearly used it to hold their bags earlier. The seat was still warm from a purse. I brushed it off and eased into it, noticing how the leaves hovered just near my shoulder, brushing against my jacket whenever I shifted. Conversation swirled around me like steam. Mum asked about flower arrangements. Dad grumbled about parking downtown. Lily detailed her bachelorette trip plans, wine tastings, and a tastefully wild Airbnb in Napa. No one asked me a thing. I sipped my water slowly, waiting, testing, hoping. Finally, between bites of eggs. "Benedict," I said, "we launched a new threat monitoring protocol last week. It's been approved for full integration across 3 major naval systems." There was a pause just long enough to be noticeable. Mum tilted her head. "That sounds complicated." She picked up her napkin, dabbed the corner of her mouth delicately, then added, "You should try simplifying it a bit, so men can understand it." My fork paused midair. Lily laughed lightly, not unkindly, just reflexively. "Mum, that's not how tech works anymore." I didn't respond right away. I let the silence stretch just long enough to become its own kind of answer. Then I placed my fork down and smiled. "I think they understand just fine. At least the ones reading my reports." Dad cleared his throat. "So, Lily, did you decide on the lace or the satin overlay?" And just like that, I vanished again. I glanced at the fiddle leaf beside me. Big, glossy leaves, easy to admire, hard to nurture. Its pot had been wedged into that corner, like an afterthought, the same way I'd been placed at this table. A green thing made to fill space not to be seen. It reminded me of the dining room table back home, the one with 6 chairs. One of them used to be mine, closest to the kitchen, where I could help carry dishes and clear plates without being asked. At some point, after I left for college, that chair had disappeared, replaced by a side table. Then, later, a decorative lamp. We needed the room, Mum had said when I asked. It was too crowded with the buffet. No one missed it. Just like no one missed me when I stopped coming home for Thanksgiving. After brunch, as we stood outside, waiting for the valet, Lily touched my arm. "Hey, I meant to say you looked serious today, like someone with secrets." I smiled softly. "Maybe I am." She tilted her head. "You don't have to be so mysterious. It's okay to let us in sometimes." But I had, years ago. They just hadn't noticed. As I got into my car and pulled away from the curb, I glanced in the rearview mirror. They were still standing together, my parents flanking Lily, like bookends, neat and symmetrical. And the chair I'd sat in, I imagined it still by the window, now empty again, collecting shadows from the plant beside it. Just like the seat I once filled at home, replaced, repurposed, eventually forgotten. But there were other places where absence didn't mean irrelevance. Places where silence wasn't weakness, but strategy. Where anonymity wasn't punishment, it was protection. My real life, the one that mattered, didn't exist at brunch tables or in family portraits. It lived underground, behind biometric scanners and reinforced doors, where no one asked what you looked like, only whether you could think 5 moves ahead of an invisible enemy. Every morning, I descended into the cold, humming belly of a secure government facility that bore no sign, no logo, just a keypad, and a silent green light that blinked when it recognized the palm of my hand. The hallway was always dim, the air dry, and still like the world outside didn't apply here. In many ways, it didn't. We worked in what they called Department 12, a name bland enough to vanish. Even our emails were routed through ghost servers. It was the kind of job people speculated about in thriller novels, but never imagined had a cafeteria with vending machines that jammed. My desk was just that, a desk. No windows, no plants, just 3 monitors. A headset and a whiteboard covered in acronyms only a handful of people in the country would understand. I monitored threat activity against US military infrastructure phishing schemes, code injections, and silent breaches disguised as server lags. Some days it was boring. Other days it meant lives. The day of Lily's engagement party, while she posed for sunset photos in her white dress, and Ethan grinned beside her like he'd invented oxygen. I was at my station, watching a sequence of anomalies light up on the central feed. A set of access requests had pinged from an IP mask originating out of the Baltics, one of our flagged zones. The pattern was familiar, but just off enough to raise the hairs on the back of my neck. Someone was testing a doorway subtle slow, the kind of breach that hides like smoke in the rafters. I isolated the node, reverse-channeled the packets, and within 9 minutes identified a backdoor being built into the firewall of an unmanned naval drone program. If it had succeeded, the consequences would have been catastrophic, not flashy, not immediate, but surgical. It would have rerouted surveillance feeds, exposed troop movements, and collapsed weeks of classified planning. And people would have died quietly, invisibly. Instead, I wrote a patch, deployed it, logged the breach, and flagged the perimeter. The system healed before it bled. No one sent flowers, no headlines were written. The only trace of my work was a string of text crawling across the black screen in front of me. Patch, successful. Code, 0-17. All zones secured. I stared at those words longer than I needed to. Sometimes I did that, just sat with the silence after a win, no matter how thankless. It reminded me that justice in its purest form was often invisible, not televised, not applauded, just done. When I left the facility that night, I walked past janitors who didn't know my name and security guards who nodded at my badge without ever asking who I really was. I got into my sedan, reliable, unremarkable, and drove home to an apartment that didn't match my clearance level or my contributions. I passed neighbours who assumed I was a librarian or maybe a high school counsellor. I didn't correct them. What would be the point? The truth wouldn't fit into small talk. Sometimes I imagined what it would be like if my mother could see me here, not at a brunch table or across from a wedding cake, but here in the control room, hands flying across the keyboard headset on guiding a team of analysts through a counter-strike while her younger daughter tried on designer shoes. But I knew she wouldn't understand. Not really. She'd ask if I was safe, if I was still doing that computer thing. She'd tell me I looked tired and recommend yoga. And yet, I kept going. Not for recognition and definitely not for them. But because someone had to. Because there were moments when the world balanced on the edge of a single keystroke, and I was the only one holding it steady. On my monitor, the screen dimmed to a resting display, a black canvas with a few thin lines of green code, trailing slowly like stars falling sideways. My fingerprint was in that code. My trace, my mind, my silent proof. I didn't need a medal. I had this. On my way back to the car, I stopped in front of the boutique window and caught the faintest ghost of my reflection layered behind Lily's still twirling, inside a stylist, adjusting her hem like she was royalty. From where I stood, it looked like we were in the same frame. But even from the sidewalk, I could tell which of us was the focus. I slipped behind the wheel and just sat there, engine off, fingers wrapped around the steering wheel, as if it could anchor me to something real. I should have been used to this, by now used to holding the frame, while someone else posed in the centre. But something about today lingered. Maybe it was the way Lily had said lucky like invisibility was a privilege, like absence was a relief. She'd never had to understand what it was like to live your life in grayscale, while everyone else moved in spotlight-lit Technicolor. I stared out the windshield, eyes unfocused, watching strangers pass with shopping bags and iced coffees, like the world had agreed to keep spinning no matter who got left out. The ache wasn't new, but it was heavy today, dense in my chest. The kind of tired you can't sleep off. A memory surfaced uninvited. I was 14, holding a camcorder at Lily's dance recital. She had just nailed her solo, the spotlight casting her in gold. I'd held the frame steady for 9 minutes straight. Afterward, Mum clapped proudly and said, "We'll make a copy for everyone." That tape sat on a shelf for years, worn from rewinding. No one remembered I was the one who filmed it. Back then, I thought that was love, making space, being useful. I thought if I just kept showing up, eventually, someone would turn the camera around. At a stoplight on the drive home, I caught my reflection again, this time in the side mirror. It was just a sliver of my face framed by traffic and grey sky. Tired eyes. Bare lips. Nothing extraordinary. And for a moment, I wondered if maybe they were right. Maybe I was forgettable. Maybe I had made myself that way, quiet, capable, low maintenance. Maybe the price of strength is becoming so self-sufficient that no one thinks you need anything anymore. But then I remembered the server room, the blinking lights, the emergency override only one I knew how to trigger. The chain of command paused for my judgment. That's who I was, not the shadow beside the bride, not the girl with the mirror. I turned up the volume on the radio static at first, then a song I didn't know. Still, it filled the space with sound, and for now, that was enough. That night, I opened my closet and looked at the dresses I'd kept over the years. Not many. One navy sheath from a work gala, a muted green wrap from a friend's wedding, and a dusty lavender thing Mum had once convinced me to buy, saying maybe if you dressed a little softer, people wouldn't find you so intense. I had worn it once. Never again. In the corner of the closet, tucked under a storage bin, I found a small handheld mirror, an old gift from Nana Elsie, the kind with delicate etching along the handle. I hadn't used it in years. When I held it up, my reflection stared back with more weight than I remembered. Not unkind, just aware. The glass caught a fragment of overhead light bouncing it off the walls. A small flare, brief and quiet, like the echo of someone who'd once whispered, "You see the world more clearly than they do. That's your gift, not your burden." I placed the mirror on my nightstand beside a stack of documents and a burner phone. And for the first time that day, I let myself exhale not in defeat, but in knowing. They still didn't see me, but I was beginning to. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not from restlessness, but from something heavier, like a thread being pulled loose in my chest. I reached for the small cedar box tucked at the back of my nightstand drawer. It smelled faintly of lavender and old paper. Inside, wrapped in a hand-sewn handkerchief, were a stack of letters written in my grandmother's script, looping deliberate with the kind of care no one takes anymore. They were dated across the years, middle school, high school, and the day I moved into my first apartment alone. I had read them before long ago, but tonight I needed her voice differently. I opened the first one, dated the week after Lily had been cast as Juliet in the school play. I had auditioned too, but landed crowd girl No. 3. Nana wrote, "The spotlight is not always honest, Claire. It chooses what glitters, not what holds. But you are the scaffolding. You keep things standing when the lights burn out." I remember crying when I got that letter back then, but quietly in the back stairwell of our house, where no one would ask why. The second letter from college. "You don't need to make noise to make history. But don't confuse silence with surrender." I had taped that one inside my dorm closet door, right above my laundry schedule. I think part of me always needed to believe someone saw the version of me that didn't need fixing. But it was the last letter, one I had avoided for years, that undid me. It was dated 2 weeks before Nana passed. Her handwriting was shakier, but still steady enough to carve straight into the heart. "If they never clap for you, Claire, keep building anyway. Not for applause, for strength, for shelter. Someone will need the place you made when the storm comes." I sat on the floor of my bedroom, legs folded beneath me like I was 13 again, that letter trembling in my hand. It wasn't grief I felt, not exactly. It was more like gratitude that had finally found the right shape. Elsie had seen me the whole time. She had written to me like I was already someone long before I knew it myself. When I arrived at work the next morning, I tucked the letter into the inside pocket of my jacket. Department 12 looked the same as always. Dim lights, keypads, the steady whir of machines humming with purpose. But something had shifted inside me. I walked straighter. I spoke clearly. When a junior analyst asked for clarification on a flagged port scan, I didn't just reply, I taught. And when the department lead, nodded in my direction during the briefing, it didn't feel like a fluke. It felt earned. Later that day, while reviewing protocol changes for an encrypted satellite array, I found a note buried in the back-end logs. One of Ethan's teams had submitted a security override on an outdated clearance string. The kind of oversight that could compromise multiple surveillance channels if not addressed. I corrected it. Quietly. Efficiently. And I submitted a recommendation, updated clearance thresholds, and mandatory digital hygiene checks for all overseas personnel. I didn't attach my name to the memo. It wasn't about credit. It was about doing the thing no one else knew how to do, because I'd been doing it invisibly for years. At lunch, I walked out to the rooftop, a place no one else used, half forgotten. I sat with Nana's letter in my lap and a plastic forkful of cold pasta in my hand. The skyline of DC stretched in front of me, full of decisions made by people who'd never know I existed. But I wasn't angry anymore. I was rooted. Like that letter had pinned something solid to the centre of me. Before I returned to my desk, I wrote something on a sticky note and tucked it inside the cedar box when I got home. Not all roots bloom above ground. It was something Nana would have said if she were still here. And somehow, in that moment, I believed it. That night, for the first time in years, I opened the old mirror she'd left me, the one with the etching of lilies along the handle. I angled it toward my face, not searching for beauty or signs of fatigue, but to see myself with the clarity Elsie had written with all those years ago. And in the mirror, I didn't see someone overlooked. I saw someone who had built a fortress out of fragments, someone who had learned the shape of her own strength without a map, someone who was ready finally for the storm, and it came sooner than expected. 2 weeks later, Lily was invited to speak at a high-profile military gala in downtown DC, a glitzy, high-clearance event sponsored by defense contractors and attended by everyone from mid-ranking officers to government liaisons. She wasn't a soldier or an analyst, but she was the daughter of a well-connected admiral and the fiancée of a decorated lieutenant. That was enough to earn a slot behind the podium. The topic was vague women and resilience in a modern world, but the dress code was not. Floor-length gowns security sweep a red carpet, where media would linger just long enough to capture legacy families smiling under chandeliers. I wasn't invited, of course. But I didn't need to be. My presence had already been requested by the infrastructure. Department 12 had been asked to oversee the digital integrity of the event. We weren't the headline, but we were the firewall. So, while Lily rehearsed her speech in front of gilded mirrors and practiced her modest chuckles for the press, I stood 4 floors below the main ballroom inside a secured control room lined with monitors and blinking panels, headphones around my neck, fingers poised on a keyboard. I wore black, not for drama, for the function. Technicians didn't need sequins, we needed quiet. Above me, the lights dimmed and the opening music began to swell. I could see the stage on one of the monitors, a narrow spotlight slicing through the velvet curtain, catching Lily's dress in a halo of gold. She looked radiant, polished. Every inch the Monroe daughter, every inch the ideal. I adjusted the camera angle slightly and checked the data stream one more time. Clean, steady, secure, until it wasn't. Midway through the first keynote speaker's introduction, one of the encrypted communication lines began to flicker. Nothing visible to the audience, just a tremor in the system. A sudden surge of outbound requests from an unregistered node inside the venue. I narrowed my eyes, pulled up the source. A corrupted update had slipped through a vendor's patch, a subtle override designed to crash a section of the internal server. If it reached the mainframe, the gala's lighting and audio sync would spiral into chaos. Microphones would shut down. Security cameras would loop. Protocols for emergency evacuation would freeze. Panic would bloom first in whispers, then in headlines. No one up there would know why, but I would. And so I moved. My hands danced across the keyboard, calm, sharp, practiced. I rerouted the system's pacing, isolated the rogue line, and deployed a countersweep through an auxiliary channel Department 12 had buried for scenarios just like this. Within 90 seconds, the system rebalanced. Lights steadied. Soundboards resumed their rhythm. Above me, applause echoed faintly through the ceiling tiles. Lily had finished her speech. She was smiling. The gala continued without interruption. No one in the room knew how close they had come to public embarrassment. No one would ever mention the girl in the control room, seated behind layers of cables and silent responsibility. But I didn't need a spotlight. I had the code, I had the knowledge, I had the power to keep things standing while the world admired the surface. I leaned back in my chair, watching Lily curtsy slightly before exiting stage left. The velvet curtain swayed behind her, graceful, unaware. That curtain I thought was the perfect metaphor. It shielded the audience from what they didn't need to see, from whom they didn't need to see. I had spent my whole life behind it, pulling levers, fixing floors, cleaning up breaches, not for glory, not even for thanks, but because someone had to. Still, as I sat there, in the quiet aftermath, a strange ache rose in my chest. Not longing, not even jealousy, just a wish that maybe once someone would look at the curtain and wonder what it was hiding, wonder who made the magic happen. But no one ever does. They clap for the actress, not the rigging. They remember the lines, not the lights. And maybe that's fine. Maybe being behind the curtain meant I could move without being seen, decide without being questioned, save without having to explain. Maybe power didn't always need applause, just presence. I logged the incident, encrypted the report, and labelled it under low visibility intervention. Successful. Another invisible notch in a ledger no one reads. Another storm diverted. Another night where I was the unknown reason things didn't fall apart. And as I exited the building through the back, naturally, I passed a side hallway lined with portraits of gala speakers from years past. Their faces were illuminated in soft gallery lights. Their names are carved into small golden plaques. I paused, then walked on. Because I didn't need a plaque. I had the velvet curtain. It had always known my name. But that night, as I folded my uniform back into the garment bag and slid my ID badge into the drawer where I kept letters from Nana, I noticed something unusual on the hallway floor. A white envelope. No markings, no post. Just my name printed in typewriter black, Commander Claire Monroe. It wasn't standard government issue. No watermark, no barcode, just precision and presence. I opened it with the careful reverence of someone expecting a trap but finding a door instead. Inside was a note on unlined stationery. Your presence is requested. Wednesday, 0900. The Pentagon Room 507. Formal attire optional. No signature, just initials. HHH Harold Harkness. General Harkness didn't send invitations. He issued a summons. The kind that redefined the shape of your career or quietly asked you to disappear. I stared at the letter for a long moment. My first thought wasn't pride. It was disbelief. Not because I didn't think I was capable, but because I had grown used to being capable in secret. I had taught myself to be the firewall, not the front page. Yet, here it was, an acknowledgement. A call, not for help, for recognition. The morning arrived heavy, with the kind of rain that made DC smell like metal and motion. I wore the uniform, 2-star shoulder stripes, brass buttons so polished they reflected more than just light. They reflected everything I'd ever swallowed just to stay standing. I took the metro even though I could have driven. The crowd grounded me, reminded me that I was still part of something larger, messy, unglamorous, human. Security cleared me in seconds. My clearance didn't trigger questions anymore. The guard glanced at my ID, then looked at me like he was seeing someone important but wasn't sure why. Room 507 was at the end of a hallway most people didn't know existed. It wasn't on the floor maps. You had to count turns like you were navigating a code. When I knocked, I expected a group, a task force, at least a table of analysts, but there was only him. General Harkness stood by the window, arms folded behind his back looking out over the city. The view was brutal and beautiful, stone buildings softened by mist flags, rippling like tired hearts. When he turned, his face was unreadable in the way only high-ranking intelligence officers could manage. "Commander Monroe," he said, "please sit. I didn't ask questions." Not yet. I sat spine-straight, hands folded in my lap. A soldier's calm, a coder's precision. He took a breath and then offered what felt like an echo of something I'd once only dreamed of hearing. "You saved that gala." My throat tightened, not from emotion, but from the shock of acknowledgement. I nodded once. "Yes, sir. We traced the override to a contractor loophole. Without your quick sweep, the incident would have made national headlines. Diplomatic fallout, security compromise, potential loss of civilian trust." He paced slowly, as if walking through the weight of what hadn't happened because of me. "You didn't just do your job. You shielded the reputation of a system that forgot to name you." I said nothing. "What was there to say? I've been watching your work for a while," he continued. "Silent saves, invisible interventions, the kind of excellence that doesn't make waves but holds up the tide." Then he laid a folder on the table between us. My name was printed across the tab, not just Monroe, not data specialist, not analyst. Commander Claire Monroe. Full name, full rank, full recognition. Inside documents outlined the formation of a new cyber intelligence initiative, one that needed leaders who didn't chase applause, one that needed the ones who knew what it meant to operate in the dark and still bring light. I'm offering you this role not just because of what you know he said, but because of how you've endured. People like you are scaffolding, and it's time we start building from the strongest parts. I thought of Nana then, her letters, her voice in my memory always soft but unshakable. "Build so strong they'll hear your silence." I almost smiled. "I don't need an answer today," he said. "But I hope you say yes. It's time they see who's been protecting their walls while they admired the wallpaper." I left with the folder pressed to my chest heart, steadier than it had been in years. I walked through the Pentagon halls past photos of generals and secretaries and soldiers in dress blues. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was walking through someone else's story. I was walking toward my own. Outside, the rain had stopped. The clouds thinned. The light was soft, not bright, not blinding. Just enough to see the path forward. I would say yes, not for them, for me, for the girl who had always stood behind the curtain. And 2 weeks later, I did. The invitation arrived in official ink bearing the department's crest and a single-line instruction report to East Hall National Auditorium, Year 800. Full dress uniform required. I held it in trembling hands, the weight of typed letters heavier than any medal could ever be. This was not a request. It was acknowledgement. It was a correction. It was the moment someone cared enough to put my name on the programme. East Hall felt different than the service gala. It was formal, hushed, built for honour. Rows of polished oak chairs stretched away from the stage. Behind them, cameras on tripods, journalists in dark suits, whispering strategy lighting rigs trained bright and cold. The red carpet I once monitored from backstage now led me to a seat labelled Monroe C, the letter C, finally on display. I waited, sitting straight legs together, heels tapping slightly under my skirt. I touched the brass nameplate once, cold, firm, undeniable. From behind the curtain, I watched faces, military, government, civilian, aware and distracted as if expecting someone else. Sidelong glances passed across the crowd, an invisible current searching for substance. My eyes drifted to my family. Lily, stunning in her satin dress, squeezed Mum's hand. They leaned forward, eager to celebrate. I realised they thought this ceremony was still about Lily or Ethan. I thought of the empty chairs at dinners past, the empty embrace, this stage. Would it feel the same? Then General Harkness took the podium. He wore his medals, immaculate chest, out silver hair swept back. His gaze moved across the crowd before settling on the curtain behind him. He began, "Ladies and gentlemen, our next award is different. This is not about visible courage in clouds of smoke or on foreign battlefields. This is about the invisible shield we never see, until it's gone." His voice carried rich, clear all-purpose. I inhaled slowly, steadying the flinch that threatened. Everyone leaned forward. He continued. 2 months ago, during a high-security gala, the kind you all attended, a silent cyber breach threatened critical infrastructure and personal data of every guest present. Were it not stopped within 90 seconds, we could have lost communications, security feeds, even lives. No alarms ever sounded in public, no panic. That peace you enjoyed, it was created by a single person. He paused. The hall rippled as if someone had turned on a gentle breeze. I felt it on my skin. I closed my eyes for a moment, remembering the control room lights, the surge. How I cut the thread before it became a trap. Quiet, but decisive. I thought of Lily's speech that night, uninterrupted, unfazed, with no awareness of how close it came to collapse. General Harkness proceeded, "We do not award for shadows. We award for substance, for clarity, for the calm that unfolds when crisis is contained. Please rise and welcome to this stage, Commander Claire Monroe." The hum of voices crashed upward like a wave. Chairs scraped, cameras clicked to life. I stood, breath caught, boots on marble footsteps echoing. I passed the journalists whose lenses tried and failed to find the woman behind the screen. I passed rows of strangers. I passed my family. Lily's eyes were large, pride trembling on her lips. Mum's hand flew to her chest like she felt the thunder in my boots. Dad looked away stiff, Ethan's mouth pinched shut, jaw pulsing. I kept walking. On stage, Harkness saluted me. I returned with a steady arm. My uniform gleamed 2 stars shining under stage lights. They weighed more than the order. They were acknowledged. I stepped to the microphone, heart pounding not from nerves, but from the gravity of belonging. I cleared my throat. The hall settled. I looked out, people in uniform, reporters, families, everyone waiting. My voice came calm, measured. "General, thank you. I have spent years building systems that died quietly. I've trained eyes to watch things that most of the world won't notice until it's too late." I paused, letting that sink in. I never expected this. I didn't do it for medals. But, standing here, it feels like arriving at a promise I once made to the girl who thought she had no place. I searched for my family's eyes. I found Lily. Her mouth trembled with shock and pride. I found Mom's sparkling tears. I found Dad looking everywhere but here. I found Ethan hunched his face tight, like he swallowed a stone. I raised my head, my voice louder. "I'm not on stage today because I fought in uniform. I'm here because I fought in silence, because I believed every keystroke mattered more than applause, because I built walls no one saw, so people they never knew would still come home. That's why I wear this uniform today, not as a symbol of ceremony, but as proof that being seen is not my victory. Being steady is." Applause began slow at first, then growing into a rhythm of respect. I nodded to Harkness, stepped back. I saluted one final time before turning away. On my downward steps, each footfall carried the weight of unseen battles. I felt the audience's attention, following not with curiosity, but with conviction. I had crossed from background to forefront. Behind me, the brass picked up a soft cue. The next honoree stepped forward, but their moment was already eclipsed for a heartbeat by someone who'd waited decades to step into her own light. I descended the stage and walked off to the side, the curtain at my back and the rest of the world ahead. No further applause needed. I had been seen, and for once, that was enough. I stepped into the wings, the velvet curtain brushing against my shoulder, like a breath of acknowledgement, gentle and final. The hallway beyond was hushed wide and waxed to perfection, echoing with the last of the applause from the hall behind me. But something held me still. Not a duty, not pride, something older, something unresolved. I turned. The door to the main hall was ajar, just enough to see the last few rows of chairs, the exit lights casting thin red shadows across marble. My family was still there. I knew it without seeing. I could feel them the way the past always lingers like static just before thunder. I walked back, slowly, not to the stage, just to the side where the audience could see me, but the spotlight didn't quite reach. Harkness was still near the podium introducing the next honoree. His voice boomed with familiar formality, but as I stepped into that in-between space, half seen, half shadowed, he paused. Just a breath. Just long enough. The crowd shifted, noticing me again. Curious, expectant. I turned toward the front row. There they were. Mum with her hands folded tightly in her lap. Lily, visibly shaken, but trying to hold a smile that no longer knows what to say. Ethan, shoulders rigid, mouth flat. And Dad, chin down, hands in his pockets, gaze fixed on the floor, as if it might explain what just happened. I didn't walk closer. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't rehearse. I just looked at them. Long enough for silence to settle over the room like snow. The hush that says something sacred is happening. Then I spoke. To be seen is not my victory. To stand here and not need your eyes. I paused, not because I had to, but because the stillness demanded it. That is, my voice didn't crack. It didn't quiver. It held. The words landed not like an arrow, but like a bell, low, clean, reverberating. A memory flickered me at 8, dressed in a too big blazer, winning the school science fair, holding up a medal that no one in my family photographed. At 15, I submitted college applications alone in a library corner because the Wi-Fi was better there. At 23, staring at a screen filled with code, patching a breach, while my mother sent Lily a cake for finally learning Excel. I had been invisible for so long, even my shadows learned how to vanish. And now, I stood in the centre of a room full of power, and they were the ones who didn't know where to look. The room, every row of officers, every civilian guest, every aide in uniform stood. Chairs creaked against marble. Palms met in applause once more. Not the thunderous kind, the kind that meant something different, something solemn. Everyone rose, except for them, my family, still seated, still uncertain whether this was their cue or their correction. They hadn't expected the silence to carry weight. They hadn't expected my absence to speak in complete sentences. I looked at them one last time, not with anger, not even with sorrow, with closure, with the kind of clarity you only gain when you finally stop asking the question, why didn't they, and start answering your own. The spotlight above shifted, catching me square in its circle, illuminating nothing but me. No one had touched a switch. It just moved, as if the light had decided on its own. And maybe it had. Maybe some truths don't wait for permission. I stood there, not stepping forward, not stepping back, letting the warmth of it land on my skin like it had been waiting a lifetime. From the far side of the room, someone began to clap again, one pair of hands sharp and certain. Then another, then more. It built slowly, like dawn cracking across a mountain ridge. It wasn't just recognition. It was understanding. That kind of applause doesn't say well done. It says, we see you now. Still, my parents remained seated. Their silence screamed louder than words. But for the first time, I didn't bend beneath it. I didn't shrink, because I had outgrown their approval. I had rewritten what applause meant, and this hush that had broken open into reverence was the sound of a story finally told. I smiled, not for them, not for the crowd, for the girl I had been, the girl who used to hold the camera, the girl who used to wrap her own birthday presents, the girl who stayed up writing code that would never be signed with her name. She had waited for this moment, and now she stood tall, in full light, with no one left to doubt her. A week later, a photograph of that stage moment hung in my childhood home's hallway, replacing the faded snapshot of Lily in her high school crown. It showed me in my 2-star uniform, face, calm eyes, steady mouth, just curling in the precise line of self-recognition. The caption under it read, Commander Claire Monroe, recognized for valor in cyber intelligence. When I saw it, I didn't gasp. I didn't even smile. Instead, I felt something like peace settle in my chest. Of all the thousands of photographs taken that night, that one captured by a staff photographer sent to cover the ceremony held meaning beyond mere image. It had reframed everything. That evening my phone buzzed. On the screen it said, Mum, I didn't know you were carrying all that. I'm sorry. Lily wish I'd asked more. I see you now. I stared at the messages, reading and rereading each one. Mourning the years gone, but grateful for this moment of reckoning. My mother's words felt soft but seismic apology folded into acknowledgement. Lily's message felt like a handshake across every year I'd waited for recognition. Part of me wanted to type back something profound that would wrap up all our shared history, all my hurt, all her oversight. But I didn't. Instead, I sent a single reply, me, thank you. That night, I sat at my desk under the new photograph on the wall, flanked by the cedar box of Nana's letters and the small, handheld mirror with lilies etched into the handle. I slid the image of me into a sleek black frame and set it gently on the table next to my laptop, the glow of the monitors casting long shadows behind it. I pulled out a piece of cardstock and sketched a simple list, one column of dates, another column of what I had done. The engagement party, the gala, the empty dinners, the sunless hours in the server room, the nights spent writing code no one would credit, and now this photograph. Each entry is anchored by a symbol, a deleted name, an empty chair, a black screen, the velvet curtain, a uniformed silhouette on stage. Below that, in bolder letters, the photo that changed everything. I paused, let the weight of that title settle, because the photo didn't just change my family's memory of me, it changed me. Later, I stepped into the kitchen to make tea. I found Lily there, drawn as though by gravity. She looked tired in that way only truth can tangibly exhaust you. She set a mug in front of me without a word. I traced the rim with my thumb. Mum told me to let you know. She's proud, Lily said softly. She turned away, reached into the fridge and pulled out a bottle of sparkling water. She twisted the cap off and leaned on the counter. I didn't know what to do after the photo went up. It was bigger than me, bigger than all of us. I thought I'd feel jealous, but I didn't. I set my mug down. It's okay, I said. You don't have to fix anything. We both stood by the counter, the small kitchen light, low the air quiet, except for the hum of the fridge. She folded her arms, looked at the photograph above the mantel mine, not hers. Lily braced her voice. Claire, I know I erased you. Not on purpose, I just never knew what part you were playing. I thought if I asked, maybe I'd break you. I swallowed. Maybe I would have. She moved closer, turned on her heels, met my gaze. But I want to start getting to know you now. The real you. I nodded. Beyond words, beyond worth. We held a quiet solidarity rooted in the long soil of shed blood and tempered over years of misunderstanding. A week later, I received a small card engraved with minimalist gold accents. To those who've been left out, written off, unseen, your light isn't theirs to switch on. Shine anyway, no signature. Perhaps it arrived on someone else's desk or was meant for publication at a storytelling channel I followed, but it felt like a chapter ending and a beginning. That night, I wrote, not a report, not a code script, but a letter to myself. I began, Dear Claire, who never made it to photos. Dear Claire, those who built systems that ran safely without fanfare. Dear Claire, who stood behind the curtain, behind the screen, behind the scenes. You are not just the frame. You are the photograph. You are the proof. I closed the laptop, read it again, and slipped the note into the cedar letterbox. Months later, I visited my parents again, this time, by invitation, framed around a small celebration, my promotion to head of the new cyber intelligence initiative. The evening sunlight spilled through the living room windows, illuminating the hallway once more. I paused before the photograph, again, not out of need, but out of reverence. My mother came up behind me, silent. She placed her hand on my shoulder. I've gazed at this photo 1,000 times, she whispered. I finally see you. I squeezed her hand. I know. My father, standing stiff in the doorway, met my eyes. Someone he hadn't looked at properly since I left for college. He cleared his throat. Well, proud doesn't say enough. You amaze me every day. I nodded, tears rising, not from anger, not from hurt, but from release. Something in us loosened. Lily stepped forward, next handing me a bouquet of white lilies. Symbols of growth, of fortitude, of quiet resilience. She didn't say much. She didn't have to. That night, over quiet champagne in their backyard, I realised that the photo didn't just change me. It changed what they could hold of me. It redrew the boundaries of what they'd believed I was capable of, and what I'd believed I deserved. Later, back in my apartment, I pinned a small sign beside my monitor, one I could see every day. Your name wasn't on their list. So, you wrote your own. And beneath it, in finer letters, to those who've been left out, written off. Unseen, your light isn't theirs to switch on. Shine, anyway. I turned off the light, closed the cedar box of letters, secure, silent, unseeming, and I exhaled with the peace of someone who had finally stepped into her own frame, whose photograph had changed everything. The apartment was quiet when I returned that evening, my small, carefully ordered sanctuary of book screens and the hum of things that made sense. I slipped off my shoes, let the door click shut behind me, and stood for a moment in the hush. There was no applause, no flicker of camera light, no voices calling my name, just the low warmth of familiarity of space that asked nothing from me except truth. I walked to my desk and sat the weight of the day folding neatly into the curve of my spine. The photo from the ceremony still stood beside my monitor. But tonight, I didn't look at it. I opened a new page in my journal instead. No encryption, no clearance tags, just paper and ink. I wrote at the top, to the girl I became when no one was watching. The words came slowly at first then, with rising momentum like a tide returning after years of drought. You built quietly. You carried weight no one acknowledged. You became the architecture behind their ease. And still, they didn't see you. I paused, letting my hand rest against the paper. The moonlight slanted through the window, catching the edge of my coffee mug, the old mirror Nana Elsie had once gifted me, and the box of letters now worn soft from memory. I kept writing. They didn't know how many nights you spent keeping systems stable while the world slept. They didn't ask. But That never stopped you. My fingers were steady now. Clear. Your name wasn't on their list, so you wrote your own. I exhaled, not from sadness, but from recognition. From finally felt aligned with the version of myself I had always been building toward. The room felt fuller, as if someone else was sitting beside me. Maybe it was Nana. Maybe it was every version of me who had waited too long to be called on. I turned the page and on the next line wrote the sentence I wanted to leave behind. To those who've been left out, written off, unseen, your light isn't theirs to switch on. Shine anyway. I closed the journal, set it gently next to my laptop. Then I lit a single candle, not for ceremony, but for symbolism. Its flame flickered with quiet confidence, small, undramatic, but persistent. Like me. And maybe like you. If you're reading this, if you've ever stood outside the gate or been the one holding the camera or sat in the chair that someone else's purse claimed, I want you to know I see you. You are not background. You are not filler. You are the foundation. Your presence is proof. Your silence is a strategy. And your story is not small just because it hasn't been told yet. So write it, line by line, even if no one asks. Especially if no one asks. Because the most powerful list you'll ever be on is the one you write yourself. This is mine. Drop your story in the comments. We see you now.